Psychologists or former psych ward patients, what are some of the creepiest mental conditions you have ever encountered? Throwaway account, and not the scariest thing here, but it is true and a bit introspective. I had many attributes of ASPD as a child. I was mistreated by my stepbrother, abandoned by my biological father at 1 month old, and physically and emotionally mistreated by my overly loving yet chemically imbalanced mother. I was also quite violent. I also had problems controlling myself when I got frustrated around animals. I enjoyed having them around, but sometimes I would lash out. I once harmed my brother that I had to be put into an inpatient care facility at 13. Upon entry to this facility, they tested my intelligence and I scored 143 with a potential of up to 190, tested by a doctor of psychology over a 3-day examination period. I always felt superior to people and significantly smarter than everyone around me. The minimum stay for this facility was 1 month with a maximum of 6 months. I wanted out as soon as possible, so at first I would hurt myself and tell my mother that the counselors were grabbing my arm and leaving bruises. That was the first week. They told me and my mother that I was very manipulative. They were correct. After the first week, I realized that the only way out was in a month, so I began to do everything they asked and made people believe that I was fine and only had anger issues. The truth was that I had no real empathy. I would, for sport, make fun of people and see how mad I could make them. I only cared for myself and what was the best for my goals. I learned how to behave in society and how to get my way. On September 11th, I'm from the hyper-patriotic American South. I watched without any feelings. That was the first sign that I noticed and realized I had issues. I proceeded to go to my university psychological services and see a counselor. I never delved in-depth into how I had few emotions except anger. Fast forward a little over 3 years later, I was watching CNN. I was a serious collegiate debater and kept it on all the time. I saw the Sumatra tsunami on the TV, then it hit me, a twinge, an emotion, and I felt heartbroken for such a massive loss of life. It was strange to have that feeling. I'd never felt anything like it before, not anger but legitimate empathy for those who suffered. 300,000 lives lost in an instant. I've never looked into how common it was for it to happen so late, but at the age of 25, I developed empathy. I allowed myself to get a dog, and whenever I harmed her, I felt terrible. At 33, I now have a strong sense of empathy but still despise people who cannot control their emotions. I have a beautiful wife, a decent job, and a well-trained dog, all of which I love. The turnaround is amazing in retrospect. The scariest thing to me now is the path I could have gone down had I never developed emotionally. It's quite frightening to see myself as I was and where I am. The scariest part were my violent tendencies, which I have fully under control, unless you're that damn cabinet door upon whose corner I keep catching my head. I'm interested in hearing some of the psychological community's perspective on this, if it doesn't get buried. I wonder if his dog ever thinks, this guy was a monster, but now he's my best friend. Story 2. Not a doctor or anything, but there was a girl in my neighborhood when I was a teenager who was seriously messed up in the head. This little girl was probably only about 10 or 11 years old, and she was absolutely goddamn terrifying. I don't mean to be mean since I'm sure she had a legitimate mental disorder, but holy heck was she terrifying. She would often wander around the neighborhood alone. I have no idea what her parents were doing and why they would let such an obviously unstable child just walk around. She did a number of severely creepy things, including, but not limited to, sit on the ground, sometimes staring at walls and talk and laugh quietly to herself, say random things out of the blue to you even if you weren't talking to her. Sometimes they would be innocent things like, okay, let's do that. But sometimes she would say strange nonsense like, why, owl, tree, green, run? Not something she actually said, just an example of the randomness. But she would say it as though she was talking directly to you, like it was a completely normal conversation. I've heard her have actual conversations, so I don't think she was just rambling random words because she didn't know how to form sentences or something. She would randomly stomp at the ground or even smack it with her hands. She would touch things like run her hand up and down a wall for minutes on end, like as if there was something special about the wall. She did this with the ground, trees, objects, all sorts of stuff. She always had this really creepy, happy demeanor. She was always smiling and giggling for no good reason. Even when she would stomp and stuff, she looked like she was having a fantastic time. I haven't even gotten to the worst parts yet. You know, like the time when she ended a squirrel and tried to give it to one of my neighbors, calling it a present. Or the time when she grabbed a butterfly with her hands. Or when she pushed my little brother into an ant pile for absolutely no reason. Literally, she was just standing there. He walked past her and she just grabbed him and threw him into the ant pile, laughing as she did it. And what was the last straw? She actually tried to end one of our neighbors. Like, no, really. She somehow got a hold of a weapon, knocked on this old woman's door and tried to harm her. Luckily, the old woman reacted quickly and managed to wrestle the weapon away from her and called the police. I'm not sure what exactly happened to her after that, but I know within days she and her parents had moved out. Story 3. Hey there, I'm a therapist. Because I respect the confidentiality of my clients, I won't tell any of the interesting stories about them. As most people will tell you, psychotic disorders or symptoms and personality disorders tend to be the most shocking or unsettling. I've worked with violent offenders, including minors, ASPD clients, layman's terms, sociopaths or psychopaths, borderline clients, schizotypal clients, and users, along with the more run-of-the-mill clients. Personally, I've never been rattled by them, but that's part of why I went into psychology. Instead of being scared by the bizarre, I tend to be curious. Instead, I'll give some general information about some of the more bizarre disorders out there. My favorite bizarre psychological phenomena to bring up in this type of conversation is the culture-bound syndrome of Koro. It occurs in Asian cultures. It is most common in men and seems to be associated with feelings of guilt or shame. Another one is brain fog, I know, weird name, which tends to affect primarily high-stress students in African countries. Basically, it's somatic blindness brought on by reading or studying too much. Pica is a disorder where people have an uncontrollable hunger for unusual items like clay, chalk, hair, paint chips, etc. I've read about extremely bad cases of hair pica where people have to have surgery to remove enormous hairballs. Obviously, eating other inorganic things can have serious health repercussions. Glove paralysis is another pretty interesting somatic disorder in which the person can't feel or move their hand or hands from the wrist down. Because of how your nerves are arranged in your arm and your hand, there's no way that it could be caused by actual nerve damage. Basically, there are two separate nerves that feed into the bottom half of your arm, pinky side, as well as your pinky and ring fingers. The other provides neurological impulses to the top, the thumb side, and your thumb, index, and middle fingers. There also exists a variety of interesting effects that can result because of damage to various areas of the brain. Aphasia, damage to the speech centers of the brain, can result in a variety of disorders of speech and speech recognition. I've worked with some TBI clients who have serious communication issues because of their brain injury, which makes progress very challenging. When there is an underlying organic cause to the disorder, it's very difficult to address it with talk therapy alone. It's always interesting to me how different psychopathology can be in different cultures. Some disorders with a strong biological component, like schizophrenia, seem to occur across the world at the same rate. Others, like eating disorders, simply do not occur with any regularity in other cultures. Story 4. Not a professional, but a friend of mine is suffering from the Capgras delusion. We moved apart several years ago and hadn't been in touch very well. I knew she had gone through some stressful times. I had a couple of phone calls with her where she was worried that her computer had been hacked, but she seemed reasonable. Then one day she called me and told me that her husband had been replaced with an imposter. She wanted me to fly to visit her so I could see him with my own eyes and confirm for her that it wasn't really him. Talking to her is simultaneously fascinating, unnerving, and heartbreaking. The worst part is, while she is clearly not correct in her beliefs, she is quite consistent in them and they are utterly real in her mind. Imagine how terrified you would be all the time if you were certain that the most important person in your life was a stranger with mysterious, nefarious motivations. Imagine going to bed every night next to someone you thought was out to get you. Imagine spending all day desperately trying to find your husband because he must be out there somewhere, right? Story 5. Reactive attachment disorder. I worked at a group home for kids with this disorder and it was creepy before I fully understood it. Children who have suffered severe and neglect early in life often have their ability to form healthy attachments to caregivers or anyone destroyed. Some of them would cling to me, call me mommy, and beg to come home with me 30 seconds after I met them. Others would refuse to talk to anyone, hurt themselves and others, set fires, and act out any chance they could. Sometimes they would improve enough to be sent to foster homes only to have their behavior come back worse once they were placed in an unstructured family setting. It's extremely tragic because there is basically no hope of a cure and they will have the disorder the rest of their lives. That's heartbreaking. It's hard to imagine the trauma those kids have already been through. Story 6. Oh, I know. Now, nobody's been diagnosed with this in 40-odd years or so, but it's still taught in most undergrad courses because it's a really good example of a culture-specific disorder. It's called Wendigo psychosis, or Wendigo, Wetiko, or Wentico, and here's how it goes down. You're a young male in an Algonquian tribe. It's been a long, cold winter, and your whole tribe is starving. You and your hunting partner have been out hunting for moose or deer or even a bear if you have to, but you've totally struck out. You're starving, he's starving, and you've seen the way he's starting to look at you over the fire at night. So you do what you have to do before he does. You terminate him. You know what happens, but you're starving, and the Wendigo comes and possesses you because the Wendigo possesses everyone. And now that the Wendigo has possessed you, you're hungrier than you were, hungrier than you've ever been before, but the only thing you're hungry for is more. So you go back to your tribe, and one of two things happen. You tell someone, and they attempt to cure you by having you eat until you retch the heart of ice you now have because you are a Wendigo demon. 35% of reported cases were cured by this method. Or you don't tell anyone, you go back to your tribe and attempt to terminate a family member. You will eventually be stopped and terminated during your rampage, and your remaining family members will burn you and scatter the ashes to prevent the Wendigo from possessing them too, the other 65% of reported cases. Story 7. Split brain syndrome. Sometimes, as a means of treating severe seizures or epilepsy, surgeons will sever the corpus callosum, the connecting tissue between the two lobes of the brain. The good news is that future full-blown seizures are limited to one half of the brain, leaving the patient aware and able to take precautionary measures. The bad news is that thanks to the lateralization of function, there are essentially two minds in the skull that can each only react to certain forms of stimuli. Patients usually develop workarounds, though. The weirdest part is the occasional outcome of alien hand syndrome, in which one of the brains takes control of one hand and uses it independently. When questions are presented to the controlling hemisphere, the hand can write out its answers, which are sometimes in disagreement with the main brain and the patient's spoken answers. It's been a while since I've studied abnormal psych, so the details might be a little fuzzy. Story 8. The selfish love/obsession of a teen with severe borderline personality disorder. This girl carved a boy's name, let's call him Steve, 10 times. Then she had intimacy with another boy so that she could get pregnant, have a termination, tell her friends that the child was Steve's, and that Steve had pressured her to have the termination. All this time, she had been spying nightly on Steve, had fake installed cameras in his house while he wasn't there to make sure he wasn't dating anyone else, and had introduced herself to every one of Steve's close family members as Steve's girlfriend while Steve wasn't around. The kicker? Steve didn't know this girl. He vaguely recalled meeting her once, but didn't know her name until I sought him out. He knew someone was pretending to be his girlfriend, but didn't know who. Story 9. I'm neither a psych major or a psychologist. However, I did spend a week in a mental ward. I had depression. I told a cop I wanted to end myself in a fit of rage, etc., etc. The hospital I was at was divided. One side was Group A, folks who needed treatment but were considered safe. Group B were the folks that had to be watched a lot more closely. About 2 days after I was checked in, another woman came in too. She was placed in Group A and was placed as my roommate. At first, she seemed nice and normal-ish, but after a few hours, her stories were getting mixed up. I mean, she came in, found out I had a kid, then said she had a daughter as well who lived with her mother-in-law or something. After dinner, the story was that her daughter had been terminated by her father and that the woman didn't even care. I voiced my concern to the nurses but was told to just go to bed in the same room with her. It took a while for me to fall asleep that night because my sleep schedule was all sorts of messed up. I think I passed out around midnight. We were put to bed at 8 p.m. I'm not sure how long I was asleep before I woke up to my roommate trying to end me. Now, we were placed in the last room at the end of the hall, far from the nurse's desk. Plus, I was being harmed, so I couldn't even yell for help. I thought I was going to pass away, but I had fallen asleep with a book, so I bashed the book and ran out of the room. The nurses probably thought I was the super crazy one, yelling at them. I'm not sure they would have believed me if it wasn't for the fact I had hand marks around my neck. My roommate was transferred to the other side of the ward, locked up with limited time out of her room. I never bothered to ask what her deal was. I didn't want to know. I had a new roommate by the end of the day. A really nice older lady who was not straight. I told her about crazy roommate number 1, and we would just go for hours at night until I was ready to pass out. Story 10. When I was younger, I was a pretty unstable kid, which led to multiple stays in a youth psych ward. One of the times I was in, we got a boy who looked like a 14-year-old fatter, paler, creepier Jack White. So we find out that he threatened to terminate his school principal, which even to a bunch of teens was psycho as hell. I slightly felt bad for him because obviously he was messed up in the head, way more than us at least. But he would say all of these awkward things trying to be funny that ended up sounding like serial quotes like, "Do you ever wonder what it feels like to be harming someone?" Which, especially to the girls, was freaky as hell. So after my roommate gets out, I hear Hannibal Lecter is moving into my room. It's weird, but I just brush it off. I was 250 pounds, 5'10", and he was just him. So a few nights would go by, nothing weird, and every once in a while when he made a messed up joke, they would pull him aside and tell him to chill out. But one day I didn't see him, and one of the doctors called me in. They tell me he is in his own room in solitary now. They pull out his notebooks and it is filled with his drawings of me while I sleep, fantasy drawings of him doing disturbing things to me. It is literally the entire notebook front to back filled with these drawings and writings. I am so petrified that I don't talk or leave my room for days. He apparently got sent to a long-term center far away, but I ended up staying even longer since they thought I would end myself over that. But that's the story. I never saw or heard from him again. I still think about it all the time. It's hard to sleep around other people anymore. Story 11. I worked as a case manager in a psych ward and was sworn into Superior Court 3, which dealt with kids being removed from the home along with various other juvenile cases. The worst I got from my boss in the court was a 15-year-old psych case. A boy was removed from the home of his single mom and two little sisters. He had obvious control issues and almost seemed mentally challenged. Learning more about him, he was incredibly manipulative. He could manage to get other people to do all sorts of things and snap back into the almost stupid, innocent person. I knew his mom wanted him in a full psych ward, and that precipitated his removal. After a couple of months of constant trips to juvie and to his community living area, I was questioning him about his statement that mom doesn't want me anymore. I asked him, that couldn't possibly be true. What makes you think that? He turned cold as day, voice changed, eyes flared, stared right into my eyes and said in a deep voice, because I mistreated her. I was taken aback. After consulting the court and having the whole family go to a new psychiatrist and more educated therapists, it came out that not only was this true, but he had mistreated his two sisters in the past multiple times. His mom only once before the cops were called and he was removed, although at the time we didn't know that was why he was removed. When the cops came, he was acting out and violent already, so he was removed on that basis. He later had to be moved to a more intensive facility. Between that and the crappy pay between two jobs that were crazy hard, I decided to go back to school. Story 12. I live with a longtime friend who I am convinced is developing or has developed disorganized schizophrenia over the past 3 years. It's not as crazy or mind-blowing as some of the other ones on this thread, but it is truly messing up his life and making it exponentially harder for me to tolerate him on a daily basis. More bizarre than anything. In the past couple of months, especially, he has exhibited extremely antisocial and disorganized behavior. Everything from inappropriate emotional reactions to irregular life events to an inability to form complete sentences or thoughts in a conversation to just plain old messing around with people by not making any sense, sometimes on purpose and sometimes unknowingly. He used to be an extremely personable guy who could approach anyone and make friends. Now he literally can't hold a conversation but still wants to be really approachable and personable, but doesn't realize that he actually creeps people out so much that they will passionately avoid talking to him again. The most frustrating thing that he does is basically attach to me whenever I'm at home. He'll stand at my bedroom door and watch me do my homework, fold my laundry, clean my room, work on my computer, build Legos, etc. And he will always be in the same room as I am unless I have shut my bedroom door. He mimics my actions, wakes up whenever I do, goes to sleep whenever I do, always wants to cook or clean whenever I am. I essentially have to find things that he can't or doesn't know how to do to get some freedom. It's mostly me because I've known him for way longer than my roommates, but when I'm not at home, he does all of this to them too. I think this all stems from his inability to make basic decisions like when to eat or what to study, or when to leave in order to be on time for something. This extends to almost every aspect of his life. I've been seeing a counselor to consult with her about it, but it's basically impossible to know anything for sure because she can't tell me any information about him or his visits. He started going as well. I don't know if he goes to them unless I ask him, and there's no telling when he will forget about a session or just decide not to go to a doctor's evaluation. It's even more frustrating that this counselor keeps telling me that I shouldn't keep reminding him of these things or keeping tabs on him because eventually I will be like a mother taking care of an infant child. My words, not hers, and she's right, but it is upsetting. Weirdest part, he's studying behavioral neuroscience. Wow, and if you're enjoying the video, learning a thing or two, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 13. I've been in a psych ward myself, and the creepiest person I met there was a girl who'd had meningitis or something, so she had a hunchback. She was a really nice, sweet, and funny person, but she hated her life and didn't think anything would get better, so she was utterly desperate to end herself. She would steal electronics from other people in the ward, like wristwatches, so she could swallow the batteries. When that didn't work, she broke her roommate's mirror. When that didn't work, they had to put her in a straitjacket in the quiet room for the night, and she would hurt her head against the padded wall, then keep going until she passed out, woke up, and kept going again and again. I know this because I was the unlucky one who had to try to sleep in the dorm room adjacent to the quiet room, and I could hear the thump every single time. I think they finally sedated her and took her to a hospital the morning after that. It's just not right for someone that young to be that desperate to pass away. Story 14. I worked 15 years in residential and in crisis mental health. Creepy things? Cleaning up a termination scene where a man harmed himself up really bad in a bathroom. I'd never seen such a mess. The case made national news and was on Huffington Post because he was part of a story. It is one thing to see photos, another thing to experience it, as the smell in a confined bathroom is quite powerful. I like working with schizophrenics at all sorts. Back in the 90s when BDP was really popular, there was a psychiatrist that was convinced all her patients were part of a ritual. She screwed up many people's lives and lost the largest psychiatric malpractice suit at the time. Just Google ritual and recovered memories to see how messed up it all is. Everyone who attended these therapy groups would come back with stories straight out of Michelle Remembers. I got into a heap of trouble by questioning these docs. Two of the psychiatrists that I worked with ended up in state mental hospitals themselves. I have very little respect for the profession and believe in 40 years we will look back on how barbaric these times were. Many people have had ECTs. It isn't nearly as bad as people like to think. I only worked with one person who had a lobotomy, mainly because he had nonstop seizures. The creepiest of the creepy are people with head injuries. Don't even get me started on the issues of impulse control, the crazy stuff, etc. Story 15. Late to the game as usual, but oh well. The first time I went to the psych ward when I was 13, there were 3 people who genuinely freaked me out. The first was the first guy I saw who was a user and was strapped down to a bed in isolation. When I walked past his room, I could see that he was flexing against the restraints and screaming, just screaming. He did this for hours. You could hear it throughout the ward. It was very unnerving. The second I met in the group room, he was 16, average height, black, which was unusual for the suburb I lived in. Unfortunate, but true. And was one of 18 brothers and sisters who had been placed in foster care, adopted out by his bio mom. He introduced himself to me, then began introducing his many friends around him who were invisible to me. This is when I learned that he had early onset schizophrenia and Tourette's, which came out in tics of hysterical laughter. He went on to have a conversation with me, turning to his friends when they interrupted. He eventually was only speaking to the invisible people. This is when I backed away. A few days later, he ended up in the quiet room and was laying on the floor whispering to himself, crying and hysterically laughing. I'm pretty sure they moved him to a state ward after this carried on for several days. The last one was when I was in the psych ward for the 5th time when I was 18. There was an elderly woman on the ward whose diagnosis I was unaware of for the length of my stay. I came back from eating one time and went into my room and laid down on the bed. Suddenly, the elderly woman walked out of a dark corner in my bedroom, stood at the end of my bed and stared at me for what felt like eternity, then went to lay on the bed beside me. I was like, nope, 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 and ran to the nurse's station. It took some time to coax her out of my bed. For anyone who is interested, the reason I've been in and out of psych wards so much is that I have borderline personality disorder. Being crazy isn't terribly fun. Story 16. I got in trouble once and the cops were saying I should piece the house for the night. I didn't have anywhere to go and was pretty distraught over crap that had been going on. They said I could check into this place for a day or two for free. It was basically some center you'd stay at and you could see counselors and stuff. At that stage in my life, counseling didn't sound like a bad idea. So I go and meet my roommate, strange kid with, I guess, super bad anxieties. He was overall super emotional. I remember he'd bum cigarettes, and when I left, I gave him 2 or 3 packs, and he went wild. He wasn't too bad, though. There was another guy who kinda was, though. I don't know what he had. He didn't look ill. He was a stout black dude who dressed like a straight G. We smoked a cig together and talked, and I didn't think anything was wrong with him. Later, I'm chilling in the break room and this cat starts talking to himself pretty fast. Like a back and forth conversation. Didn't pay much thought to it though. Then later, I see him jamming to some song on the radio and the song ends and the DJ starts talking and he begins trying to talk to the DJ and sounds pretty mad. I didn't look at him to not be rude, but he stopped arguing with the radio and gave me a heavy stare. So I left the room and heard him go back at it. I told the worker, but they said he was fine. Then there was another woman who had it really bad. I was told it was schizophrenia. She sat in the room coloring, scribbling on paper, literally almost all day long. Mental illness really interests me, and I've always wanted a job where I could help people with problems feel better, so I really thought this was a chance to help and maybe become friends. I tried approaching her a few times, offered her a cig, to do a puzzle with her, and also just to hang out. Not once would she even pay attention to me. It was like I wasn't there at all. I don't know why I couldn't get a response, but the way she acted really gave me an idea how intense schizophrenia is capable of being. I know this stuff doesn't sound like much, but some of it took me aback. Story 17. Not a psych major or a psychologist, but I knew a girl who was incredibly smart and beautiful. I learned that she was mistreated emotionally, verbally, and physically by her mom when she was little, mistreated by her grandfather and her cousin, and bullied relentlessly in school. She still lives the normal life of a normal human being, but the immense scars on her psyche caused by her events was kind of disturbing. She started to have these severe anxiety attacks that were nothing like I've heard or seen before. She'd drop on the floor and start twitching, slowly, but then building up to something like a seizure. She would scream, tears streaming down her face, hit herself, pull her hair, eyes rolling back, whisper and whimper to people who aren't there, and even more disturbingly, scratch herself while laughing. She's incredibly talented and she's completely conscious of her problem. It's very strange. Her mind tends to wander a lot and she obsesses over living in different realities rather than the one she lives in right now. She would constantly read books and watch movies, TV shows, and create a universe in her head and live in it to escape. She can't handle the paradoxes of the universe because when she thinks too much and too deeply, she starts attacking herself again, the seizure-like stuff. To make it even worse, she often tends to think everyone's out to get her, like paranoia, even though she consciously knows that it's irrational. It's almost like all these disturbing things she does are controlled by something or someone else inside of her. 2 years ago, she moved a couple of states over. I know all of this because I used to be one of her only confidants, and even she didn't trust me with the deepest and darkest secrets of her psyche. She has severe trust issues. To this day, I still hope she's doing okay. Story 18. Not a psychologist, but I had a particularly creepy encounter with a psychologically unstable student when I was an RA in college. We'll call him Brian. Earlier in the school year, Brian had presented himself as a perfectly chill guy. He was friendly to everyone, chatty, overall pretty normal. But as the year progressed, his behavior became increasingly odd. He was still a friendly guy, but there were instances where it felt like a switch had been flipped. I'm not sure how to describe it. He was friendly, but his friendliness seemed like a front to cover up his cold, malicious nature. He started lying a lot and doing things to creep out other students who had been his friends up until that point. Brian's parents eventually pulled him out of school and took him back to their hometown in the Midwest. I wasn't there when they packed up his room, but I had been told that he had become angry and violent. Many of the students were relieved that he was gone, not because they disliked him, but because they were straight up afraid of him. Fast forward a few months, I'm on duty in the RA's office. All of my coworkers, literally all of them, including the residence directors, had gone to a farewell dinner for one of the RAs who was leaving. I volunteered to stay behind and man the office. It's probably like 10 p.m. I'm all alone in the office, and who walks in? Brian. He slowly walks up to my desk, looks at me, and asks for the key to his room. He said, "I'm back from vacation now." I will never forget how absolutely cold his eyes looked. He was looking directly at me, but it felt like he was looking beyond me. There was just no sense of life in his eyes at all. I'm finding it hard to describe how utterly creepy it was. It was terrifying. I was all alone in a room with a psychologically unstable student who was twice my size, with no one nearby to help me if he snapped. I don't remember exactly how I managed to get out of the situation, but eventually we found out that he had flown back to school without telling his parents. We found his suitcase in a lobby nearby. All he had packed was a change of clothes and mags. Story 19. I have studied psychology to a small extent and score high on the scale used to identify psychopaths. Nothing on here scares me, though I can identify with portions. I am high functioning in that I have a family, run a company, and am very well educated. I also know that I can be manipulative, but as a general rule, keep subtle as it is to my greatest benefit. I don't know if I feel empathy. I know what I am meant to feel and react accordingly. The worst part is that many years ago I sought help and went through maybe 4 or 5 psychologists. It was a game to mess with them and they would not see me anymore, so today I still wish that I had the opportunity to explore who and what I am, but cannot as I will not have anything officially down on record because of my work and professional aspirations. People with this are not always cancerous. I know that I am different. I am strongly law-abiding and seek to create a better world for others. Don't confuse that with autism. If a student or the like would want anonymous discussion, I would be willing to do so. Story 20. I'm not a psychologist, but I do have some psychological/cognitive disorders, and one of them is very creepy. The not-so-creepy disorder I have is a panic disorder, treated conservatively with exercise and relaxation techniques. The creepy disorder I do have is hypnopompic hallucinations, which I'm not sure there is any treatment for. Hypnopompic hallucinations occur when you're just waking up, so you feel like what you're seeing is very real because you know you're awake. I actually had one last night where I was convinced I saw someone moving around in my apartment. I turned my flashlight on in the direction I saw the person until I was finally convinced it was just a hallucination. I typically have these hallucinations at night, but they have also occurred when I wake up from a nap during the day. My hallucinations usually involve bugs, spider, people, and occasionally flying things like bats or just imagined flying creatures. It doesn't last for very long, usually 5 to 10 seconds, but it is very frightening. Story 21. Psych major, still in school. A bunch of the classes we're required to take basically just involve working at various mental health facilities for so many hours a week. You can choose your location, so I bumped around between Eastern State and the VA. If you don't know anything about Eastern State, it's basically Shutter Island located in central Kentucky. It's the oldest psychiatric hospital in the United States and hasn't really changed much through the years. They still have dungeons, not in use, where they used to keep patients. Whenever they renovate, they run the risk of finding mass unmarked graves. The buildings look like they were salvaged from the Titanic. Overall, it's got a creepy you never leave here alive vibe. Anyways, all of the students were assigned to chill with a specific person. Some people were assigned to patients with depression, eating disorders, etc. I was paired with a man with active psychosis and schizophrenia. He was surprised when I told him that I was fully human because most people have Terminator DNA mixed in these days. But there's nothing wrong with that because even full Terminators have souls. He was a very progressive person in his view on machines. He believed he was John Connor and that Eastern State was his palace. He was always very sweet and let me know that if I needed a room to stay for the night, he would have one prepared for me and have them beam me whatever food my heart desired. In general, he was pretty harmless. He was just permanently institutionalized because he couldn't maintain personal hygiene and he would forget to eat. He was a permanent resident of about 7 years because they couldn't find the right medication balance. So one day, we're talking just like usual and he's telling me his life story. He was Adam and was actually millions of years old even though his human body was 17. In reality, he was probably in his 40s. And his daughter was Eve, and they were very much in love and living happily in Eden together until the aliens came and took her. Then he quickly recovered by saying that she still visits a hospital, the only time he never called it the palace, every week. At the end of the semester, I was explaining to him that I was going to have to leave and wouldn't be around as much anymore. He leaned in and whispered, "It's been good, honey. Now if you go home and you're pregnant, don't worry. I just gave you a dose of some Terminator DNA." Another guy at the VA was a Vietnam vet. A lot of the guys there will talk about guilt they have over committing or witnessing what they personally describe as termination. This guy did not. He was constantly in and out for anger-related violence. He watched his friend pass away and really just became unhinged after that. A lot of the docs speculated that he had repressed guilt about the incident, but he never showed it. He was very proud of what he did. Story 22. I have a very close uncle who has lived his life since 17 with manic depression and schizophrenia. It's been sad and it's been very frightening, and it has never been openly talked about. So strange. My mother is far too close to him, and as such, she suffered through a lot of violence and horrible treatment. As a child, I watched him attack my older brother, my father, and smack my mom around during different episodes. He's also a master manipulator, and I am witnessing him deplete my older mother of her savings as he manages to guilt her into action every time. I try to change it, but it's been going on for so long. I want to feel bad for him, and I try to understand it. I still harbor lots of fear and anger. As a young female currently, I still have horrible nightmares about him. This past year, he was charged by a neighbor. His condition is getting worse with age. I stay away as I think my mom will sadly pass away before him as she is the older sibling. I'm not willing to be the replacement, so I keep my distance. I think he begrudges me because of it, which scares me even more. Well, that's a tough situation. Family dynamics can be complicated, especially when mental illness is involved. Story 23. When I was in a mental hospital for my OCD, there was a girl who had tried to mistreat her sister. She was the strangest person I've ever met, albeit the way her mind worked was fascinating. She was about 12. She always had really thick makeup on like a clown and was always wearing a bathrobe. She wore heels with her bathrobe too. I know she did something awful, but you could tell she was just a remorseful kid. Whenever we'd go around and explain why we were in the hospital during our group therapy sessions, she'd just look down shamefully and say she didn't want to talk about it. It seemed like there was something afflicting her and she was suffering from it. My roommate had multiple personality disorder. She tried to convince me she had OCD, was schizophrenic, ADD, ADHD, and a multitude of other disorders. She was about 12 as well and also tried to convince me that she had a baby she was taking care of on her own because her family hated her. Found out she was lying, also found out her father had mistreated her too. Story 24. I'm not a psychologist, but a social worker that oversees 5 group homes. These group homes each house 4 to 8 adults with intellectual disabilities. My favorite house or caseload has 8 housemates who all have dual diagnosis of MR and mental illness. I really like the clients there, but some of them are so messed up it's difficult to deal with at times. One in particular has very bizarre tendencies. He's on a large amount of psychotropics for his schizophrenia and other various disorders. He's also moderately intellectually disabled. He typically seems quite spiked up because of the meds he's on and doesn't seem to feel pain much. Anyway, I once knocked on his bedroom door and he told me to come in. I came in and he was doing something weird to a hunting magazine. The page he was on had deer getting field dressed. He just kept on doing something weird and I was stammering, trying to figure out the fastest way out of the room. To his credit, he is a very sweet guy. He's never been inappropriate with anybody else and always does this in the privacy of his own bedroom. But if you knock and he's doing something, he will invite you in and he will not care if you are there. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.